November 13th, 2022. That date is etched into the very soul of Moscow, Idaho, a town that prided itself on its quiet streets and tight-knit community. Up until that morning, violent crime here was almost unheard of. We're talking about a place where you left your doors unlocked, where college kids walked home from parties without a second thought. It was idyllic, almost a postcard image of small-town America. But that peace, that sense of security, was shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. I got the call early, just before noon, reporting a possible unconscious person at a rental home on King Road, right near the University of Idaho campus. Even then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Unconscious person often means more than it sounds. My deputies were first on scene, and what they found vedye it was beyond anything we'd ever prepared for. 4 University of Idaho students vedye Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, and Kaylee Goncalves, all gone. Not by accident, not by overdose, but by an act of unimaginable violence. Stabbings, multiple victims in their own beds. The house, usually bustling with life and laughter, was now a crime scene of immense scale and horror. The initial moments were chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. We had 2 other roommates who had survived, thankfully physically unharmed, but clearly traumatized beyond belief. They were the ones who eventually called 911 after waking up later that morning, realizing something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a national shockwave. 4 young lives, vibrant and full of promise, extinguished in the dead of night. The sheer brutality of it, the lack of any clear motive at first glance, it sent a ripple of fear not just through our small town, but across the entire country. Everyone was asking the same question: who would do this and why? And honestly, at that moment, standing there looking at the unfolding horror, we had absolutely no answers. Only questions and a chilling certainty that our quiet town would never be the same again. The crime scene was immense, and it was complex. 4 victims across multiple rooms. We immediately called in every resource we could get our hands on vedye, Idaho State Police, the FBI vedye Trademark S Behavioral Analysis Unit, forensic experts from across the region. We knew we were in over our heads for a case of this magnitude. Every square inch of that house became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Our deputies, bless their hearts, had to pivot from community policing to navigating one of the most horrific scenes imaginable. One of the first critical pieces of information came from the surviving roommates. They were asleep on the ground floor during the attack. One of them, Dylan Mortensen, had opened her door around 4 a.m. after hearing what she described as crying. She then heard a male voice say something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." When she opened her door a second time, she saw a figure. A man, dressed in black clothing with a mask covering his mouth and nose, walking past her. He was described as male, not really tall but athletically built, and he walked right past her out the sliding glass door on the ground floor. Think about that for a second. The killer, allegedly, walking right by a witness, completely undetected until that moment. It was chilling. This witness account was invaluable, but it also painted a picture of a phantom, a ghost. He just vedye left. No forced entry, no obvious signs of a struggle that woke everyone up immediately. He came and went with a terrifying efficiency. We had no name, no clear description beyond athletically built male. Vedye Trademark S, not a lot to go on when you're hunting a quadruple murderer. Then came the surveillance footage. We started pulling every camera feed from every house, every business, every streetlight in Moscow and the surrounding areas. Hours upon hours of video. Our analysts were sifting through it all, frame by frame, looking for anything out of place. And vedye Trademark S when a pattern started to emerge. In the early morning hours of November 13th, around the time we believe the murders occurred, a white Hyundai Elantra was spotted multiple times. Cruising past the King Road house, making multiple passes, almost casing the joint. And then, after the estimated time of death, it was seen speeding away from the area. This white Elantra became our ghost car. It was elusive. We had grainy footage, timestamps, but no license plate, no clear shot of the driver. We put out a public plea for information about a white Hyundai Elantra from 2011-2016. The leads poured in, thousands of them from all over the country. Every white Elantra became a potential clue, every owner a potential person of interest. We were chasing a shadow, a vehicle, and a description, knowing that somewhere out there was the person responsible for tearing our town apart. And we knew, absolutely knew, we had to find them before they could strike again. The pressure on our team was immense, not just from the media, which was relentless, but from the community itself. People were scared. University students went home early for Thanksgiving, many afraid to return. Parents were calling us, demanding answers. We felt that weight every single day. We had thousands of tips coming in. Every single one had to be vetted, no matter how outlandish. We were sifting through a haystack, looking for a needle that could bring us closer to these monsters. While the patrol division and our analysts were chasing the white Elantra and sifting through surveillance, our forensic teams were meticulously processing the crime scene. Every drop of blood, every fiber, every print, every piece of debris was bagged and sent to the lab. It's painstaking work, often thankless but absolutely critical. And it was in that house, amidst the horror, that we found a critical piece of physical evidence: a single, leather-buttoned knife sheath. It was found next to one of the victims, almost like it had been left behind in a hurry, or perhaps even intentionally. This wasn't just any sheath. It had a Kohberger inscription on it, a specific type of knife, often associated with military or hunting. More importantly, on that sheath, our forensics team was able to lift a single source of male DNA. This was it. This was our golden ticket. Now we had biological evidence, a direct link to the perpetrator, assuming it belonged to him. The DNA was sent to the state lab, and then quickly to a private lab specializing in genetic genealogy. Meanwhile, our investigators started digging deeper into the VICTIM's Vedya trademark lives, looking for any connections, any enemies, anyone who might have had a reason to target them. We looked at ex-boyfriends, friends, acquaintances, anyone who had been in that house or near it. No stone was left unturned. We interviewed hundreds of people. The surviving roommates provided what they could, though their memories of the exact timing and specifics were understandably muddled by trauma. We were building a timeline, minute by agonizing minute, of those early morning hours. As the DNA analysis was underway, our behavioral analysts from the FBI were working with us, building a profile. What kind of person commits such an act? What were their patterns? Was this personal? Was it random? The initial assessment was that the attack was targeted, or at least that the house itself was the target. The brutality suggested a rage, or perhaps a deep-seated psychopathy. We were looking for someone who was likely meticulous, perhaps even methodical, given the way the crime was committed without immediate detection from other occupants. The pieces were slowly, painstakingly starting to come together. We had a suspect vehicle, we had a witness description, and now we had DNA. But the big question remained: how did these three seemingly disparate clues, Vedya, a car, a phantom description, and a genetic profile, Vedya, all connect to a single individual? That was the challenge that lay ahead, and it required an unprecedented level of cooperation and dedication from every agency involved. With the DNA profile in hand, the search intensified. Our partners at the private genetic genealogy lab were working around the clock, trying to build a family tree from that single DNA sample. It's an incredible science, taking an unknown sample and comparing it to public DNA databases to find relatives, which then helps narrow down a potential suspect's family line. Vedya trademark S like finding a needle in a haystack, but then realizing that needle has an entire family tree attached to it. At the same time, the focus on the white Hyundai Elantra was yielding more specific results. Through meticulous cross-referencing of vehicle registration databases, surveillance footage from adjacent counties, and even traffic camera data, we started to get a clearer picture of that car's movements. We were able to trace a specific white Elantra, and more importantly, its registered owner. The name that came up was Bryan Kohberger. Now, this is where the pieces began to dramatically snap into place. When we looked into Bryan Kohberger, we found he was a Ph.D. student in criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. Pullman is just a short drive across the state line from Moscow, Idaho. ITV trademark SASTON, EVA trademark S-throw. The irony of a criminology student being a prime suspect in such a heinous crime was not lost on us. It was a LMOST taunting. And it wasn't just the car. We then started pulling cell phone data. With a court order, we could look at cell tower pings associated with Bryan Kohberger trademark S phone. What we found was damning. His phone, or at least a device associated with him, had pinged off cell towers in the vicinity of the King Road house on at least 12 occasions prior to the murders. 12 times. This wasn't a random drive-by. This indicated surveillance, reconnaissance. He wasn't just passing through. He was familiarizing himself with the area, with the house, perhaps even with the routines of the victims. And then came the most crucial pings. In the early morning hours of November 13th, Kohberger's phone was detected leaving the area of Pullman, traveling into Moscow, and then leaving Moscow shortly after the time of the murders. There was a brief period where his phone went dark, which could be indicative of the phone being turned off or put into airplane mode to avoid detection, before reappearing on the network as he drove back towards Pullman. This pattern of movement perfectly aligned with the white Elantra, a Vedya trademark S trajectory, W, Vedya trademark D painstakingly pieced together from surveillance footage. We now had a vehicle, a location, phone data placing him there, and a general description that matched. But the ultimate connection, the irrefutable link, still needed to be made. We had the DNA from the knife sheath, and we had Bryan Kohberger as our primary suspect. The goal was now clear: confirm that the DNA from the crime scene belonged to Bryan Kohberger. But we couldn't just go up to him and ask for a DNA sample. We needed to be strategic, careful, and gather irrefutable evidence for an arrest and a conviction. The net was closing, slowly, methodically, around our suspect, and the focus shifted from who to how do we catch him definitively. Once Bryan Kohberger was identified as our primary suspect, the investigation became incredibly focused and, frankly, extremely delicate. We were dealing with someone who we believed was highly intelligent, meticulous, and capable of extreme violence. We couldn't afford a single misstep that might tip him off or jeopardize the case. The decision was made to place him under active, 24/7 surveillance. This wasn't just a local operation. We had learned that Kohberger, shortly after the murders, had driven his white Hyundai Elantra all the way across the country to his family home in Pennsylvania for the winter break. This meant our surveillance effort became a multi-state, multi-agency operation. The FBI trademark S surveillance teams are among the best in the world, and they picked up the trail. Imagine the tension monitoring a suspected quadruple murderer, thousands of miles away from the crime scene, trying to gather that final, irrefutable piece of evidence. The goal of the surveillance was twofold. First, to ensure he didn't flee or commit any further acts of violence. Second, and crucially, to obtain a DNA sample directly linked to him. We couldn't just get a warrant for his DNA without further probable cause that would stand up in court. So, we had to wait, watch, and be patient. The FBI teams in Pennsylvania tracked his every move. They watched him go about his daily life, seemingly normal, while secretly collecting discarded items that might contain his DNA. This is often how it works in these high-stakes cases. You wait for the suspect to throw something away, a coffee cup, a napkin, anything that might have saliva or skin cells on it. And then it happened. On December 27th, while under surveillance, investigators were able to covertly collect trash from the Kohberger family residence. This trash contained biological material. That sample was immediately rushed to a lab for analysis, specifically to compare it to the DNA found on the Kohberger knife sheath at the crime scene. The hours that followed were agonizing. Everyone involved, from the agents on the ground in Pennsylvania to myself back in Idaho, was holding their breath. We knew this was the moment of truth. If the DNA matched, we had our man. If it didn't, we'd be back to square one, or at least facing a massive setback, and a killer would still be at large. The results came back quickly, confirming our worst fears and our strongest suspicions. The DNA profile from the trash matched the DNA profile from the knife sheath found at the crime scene. It was a definitive match. The phantom had a name: Bryan Christopher Kohberger. With that confirmation, the decision was made. The arrest warrant was secured. The date was December 30th, 2022. Just 6 weeks after the murders, we were ready to bring him in. The silence in Moscow had been shattered by violence, but now a new sound was about to echo, the sound of justice beginning to be served. December 30th, 2022. It was still dark in Chestnut Hill Township, Pennsylvania, a quiet, almost sleepy residential area where Bryan Kohberger was staying with his family for the holidays. But it was far from quiet for the teams of law enforcement converging on that house. The Pennsylvania State Police, working hand in hand with the FBI, executed the arrest warrant. This wasn't some haphazard knock on the door. This was a meticulously planned operation. University trade Mark Reed dealing with a suspect believed to be capable of extreme violence, who is likely intelligent enough to be dangerous even in an arrest scenario. Safety for the officers and the surrounding community was paramount. The SWAT team moved in swiftly and efficiently. It was a no-knock warrant, meaning they breached the door without warning. There could be no chance for him to destroy evidence or worse, to arm himself and resist. We didn't know what we'd find inside. Would he fight? Would he try to flee? Would there be other surprises? According to reports from the officers on the ground, Kohberger was apprehended without incident. He was taken into custody in the early hours of the morning. There was no struggle, no dramatic chase. Just the abrupt, overwhelming presence of law enforcement ending his freedom. It must have been a jarring realization for him, waking up to the reality that his meticulously planned, brutal act had finally caught up to him. During the search of the Kohberger residence in Pennsylvania, investigators seized several items. This included his white Hyundai Elantra, which was found parked at the house. This was the ghost car we'd been chasing for weeks, now sitting silently, a tangible piece of evidence connecting him to the crime. The car was immediately processed for forensic evidence, hoping to find traces of the victims or anything that further solidified its presence at the King Road house. News of the arrest broke quickly. Within hours, it was all over national news. The Moscow Police Department, who had been under intense scrutiny and pressure, finally had something concrete to tell the grieving families and the terrified community. I remember the feeling that day, a mixture of profound relief that we had him, but also a renewed sense of sorrow for the victims and their families. An arrest wasn't a conviction, but it was the crucial first step. The next challenge was getting him back to Idaho. He was arrested on an out-of-state warrant, so extradition proceedings began almost immediately. Kohberger chose not to fight extradition, which simplified the process. It showed a certain resignation, perhaps, or a strategic move from his legal team. Regardless, the wheels of justice were turning, and they were turning fast. Our focus shifted from who did it to how do we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. The journey wasn't over. It had merely entered a new, equally critical phase. Once Bryan Kohberger was in custody in Pennsylvania, the focus immediately shifted to bringing him back to Idaho to face justice. This wasn't a simple crosstown transfer. It was a carefully orchestrated operation to transport a high-profile, extremely dangerous suspect across thousands of miles. The security protocols were immense, involving multiple agencies, ensuring his safe, secure, and uneventful journey from Pennsylvania to Latah County, Idaho. Every step was considered, from the route to the type of transport, to prevent any unforeseen incidents. He appeared in a Pennsylvania courtroom for his extradition hearing. Kohberger waived his right to fight extradition, which, while not a confession of guilt, certainly streamlined the process. It signaled that he was ready, or perhaps resigned, to face the charges in Idaho. This saved us weeks, possibly months, of legal wrangling that we frankly didn't have the time or resources for, given the urgency of the case and the community's need for closure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity for us and the victims' families, Bryan Kohberger was flown back to Idaho. His arrival in Moscow was met with a heavy media presence. Every camera, every reporter, every citizen of Moscow was watching. It was a moment of profound significance, the physical manifestation of justice beginning to unfold in our quiet town. He was then transported to the Latah County Jail, where he was formally booked on the 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. His initial court appearances in Idaho were swift. These are procedural hearings, designed to officially read the charges, inform the defendant of their rights, and set the initial stages of the legal process. During one of these early hearings, he stood silent when asked to enter a plea. In Idaho law, and in many jurisdictions, if a defendant refuses to enter a plea, the court automatically enters a plea of not guilty on their behalf. This is a common legal strategy, often used by defense attorneys who are still reviewing the vast amounts of discovery evidence, or who simply wish to preserve all legal options. It's not an admission of guilt, nor is it a statement of innocence. It's a procedural move. The court also quickly issued a gag order in the case. This was absolutely critical. With the immense national and international media attention and the highly emotional nature of the crime, there was a real risk of tainting the jury pool, or of sensitive information being leaked that could compromise the integrity of the prosecution or the defense. The gag order restricted what law enforcement, attorneys on both sides, and even the families could publicly say about the evidence and details of the case. It was frustrating for the public, who craved every detail, but it was a necessary step to ensure a fair trial. With Kohberger formally charged and in custody, the investigation shifted gears from active manhunt to meticulous preparation for trial. The collection of evidence didn't stop, but now it was about packaging it, organizing it, and preparing it to be presented in a courtroom. The story of the shattered silence of Moscow was now entering its most formal, and perhaps longest, chapter: the pursuit of justice through the legal system. Once Bryan Kohberger was back in Idaho and had made his initial appearances, the focus of the prosecution team became building an ironclad case for trial. The first major hurdle was establishing probable cause, a legal standard that means there is sufficient reason to believe a crime has been committed and that the accused person committed it. This is not the same as beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard for conviction, but it's crucial for moving forward. The probable cause affidavit was a critical document in this phase. TM's essentially a sworn statement by an officer, outlining the evidence gathered so far that links the defendant to the crime. When that document was unsealed and released to the public, it provided the first real glimpse into the depth of our investigation and the key pieces of evidence we had amassed against Kohberger. That affidavit laid out a compelling narrative. The DNA, the recovery of the Ka-Bar knife sheath and the male DNA found on it, which was later matched to Kohberger. This was a direct, physical link to the scene. The Elantra, the detailed timeline of the white Hyundai Elantra, placing it repeatedly in the vicinity of the King Road house, both before and during the murders, and then speeding away. This was backed by multiple surveillance videos. The cell phone data, the pings from Kohberger's cell phone, corroborating the car's movements vedye, showing his phone in the area of Moscow in the hours leading up to and immediately after the murders, and then showing a pattern of apparent surveillance in the weeks prior. The witness account, Dylan Mortensen's harrowing account of seeing a masked, athletically built, male figure walking past her just moments after the presumed time of the attack. This description was consistent with Kohberger. Academic background: the chilling detail that Kohberger was a Ph.D. student in criminal justice, specializing in criminology, at a university so close to the crime scene. This wasn't direct evidence of the crime itself, but it certainly raised questions about motive and methodology, suggesting a potential fascination or study of criminal acts. This combination of DNA, digital forensics, cell phone and vehicle tracking, and an eyewitness account created a powerful picture of probable cause. It was a testament to the painstaking work of our investigators and forensic teams, piecing together fragments into a cohesive, if horrifying, narrative. Originally, a preliminary hearing was scheduled, where a judge would hear testimony and review evidence to determine if there was indeed probable cause to send the case to trial. However, that hearing was ultimately vacated. Instead, the prosecution took the case to a grand jury. A grand jury is a group of citizens who hear evidence presented by the prosecutor in secret. Their role is to decide if there's enough probable cause to issue an indictment, which formally charges the defendant and moves the case to district court for trial. The grand jury met, heard the evidence, and deliberated. In May of 2023, they returned a true bill, indicting Bryan Kohberger on all 4 counts of first-degree murder and the felony burglary charge. This indictment meant the grand jury believed there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. It was a significant step forward, bypassing the preliminary hearing and pushing the case directly towards a courtroom showdown. The stage was now fully set for what would undoubtedly be one of the most closely watched trials in Idaho's history. With the grand jury indictment, the case against Bryan Kohberger officially moved into the district court for trial. This is where the legal battle truly begins, a painstaking process of discovery, motions, and eventually, if a plea agreement isn't reached, a full trial before a jury. But before all of that, a critical decision was made by the Latah County Prosecutor's Office. They announced their intention to seek the death penalty for Bryan Kohberger. This is not a decision made lightly, especially in a state like Idaho, where capital punishment is on the books but rarely sought, and even more rarely carried out. It signals the extreme gravity with which the state views these crimes. Seeking the death penalty means the prosecution believes the murders were committed with especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel intentions, or that there were other aggravating circumstances that warrant the ultimate punishment under Idaho law. For a quadruple homicide of this nature, where young lives were brutally taken, the prosecution clearly felt this was justified. The announcement immediately elevated the stakes of the trial to the highest possible level. It means the defense team will fight even harder, employing every legal strategy available to prevent their client from being sentenced to death. This will involve intense scrutiny of every piece of evidence, every procedural step, and every aspect of Kohberger's background. The legal process from here is complex and often lengthy. Both the prosecution and the defense will engage in extensive discovery, where they exchange evidence, witness lists, and expert reports. The defense will undoubtedly file numerous motions, Ph.D. motions to suppress evidence, motions to change venue due to extensive media coverage, motions to challenge the validity of certain evidence like the DNA or cell phone data. Each motion will be argued before the judge, and the rulings could have significant impacts on the trajectory of the trial. We anticipate a lengthy jury selection process, known as voir dire, given the immense publicity surrounding this case. Finding impartial jurors who haven't already formed an opinion will be a monumental task. The trial itself will involve presenting all the accumulated evidence Ph.D., the forensics, the digital data, the eyewitness accounts, expert testimonies Ph.D. to a jury, aiming to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If Kohberger is convicted of first-degree murder, there would then be a separate penalty phase, where the jury would hear arguments and evidence specifically to decide whether to recommend a sentence of life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. This phase involves a deep dive into aggravating and mitigating factors. For the victims' families, this is a long, arduous road. While they crave justice, the process itself is a constant reopening of wounds. For us in law enforcement, our job now transitions fully into supporting the prosecution, ensuring all evidence is meticulously preserved, and being ready to testify and present the facts of our investigation in court. The hunt for the killer is over, but the fight for justice, with the highest possible stakes, is just beginning. As we stand now, the legal proceedings against Bryan Kohberger are ongoing. The trial itself has not yet begun, and as anyone familiar with the justice system knows, these high-stakes cases can take years to fully resolve. There will be countless motions, evidentiary hearings, expert testimonies, and appeals. For the community of Moscow, and especially for the families of Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee, this means an agonizing wait. A wait for answers, a wait for accountability, and ultimately, a wait for some semblance of peace. The impact of these murders on Moscow, Idaho, is profound and lasting. The innocence of our town was lost that night. The feeling of safety, once taken for granted, has been irrevocably altered. University students, parents, and longtime residents alike now look at their surroundings differently. Locks are on doors that once stood open. A sense of vigilance, a quiet sadness, now permeates the streets that were once so carefree. THERE trademark S, a memorial on campus, a place for remembrance, a stark reminder of the lives that were so cruelly cut short. For the surviving roommates, Dylan and Bethany, their lives have been forever changed by the trauma they endured. Their bravery in those initial hours and their cooperation with law enforcement were absolutely critical to this investigation. They woke up to a nightmare, and they continue to live with its aftershocks. For law enforcement, this case represents an unprecedented effort. The collaboration between local police, Idaho State Police, the FBI, and countless other agencies was truly remarkable. It showed what can be achieved when everyone pulls in the same direction, driven by a shared determination to catch a killer and bring justice to victims. From sifting through thousands of tips, to meticulously analyzing cell phone pings, to the cross-country surveillance and DNA matching, every single person played a vital role. While the legal battle continues, our commitment remains unwavering. We brought Bryan Kohberger back to Idaho to answer for these crimes. The evidence we've collected, we believe, will speak for itself in court. ITVEDIA trademark S, a painstaking process, designed to ensure due process for the accused, but also to ensure that justice is served for Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee. The shadows of that terrible night still linger over Moscow, but we hope that through this process, through the tireless work of all involved, the community can eventually find a path toward healing. We will see this through to the very end so that the victims can finally rest and the town of Moscow can, one day, begin to reclaim the peace that was so violently stolen from it. The story of what happened on King Road will forever be a part of our history, but so too will the story of how a community and law enforcement came together to fight for justice.